Welcome back to How It's Restored. My name is David Cooper. We're going to dive into the restoration of the mechanicals, the engine, the chassis, the different parts underneath the hood. Typical hoses, seals, and everything else were not designed to work with modern gasoline. So they all get disintegrated when you put this stuff together. And then when you replace the seals with modern materials, you can make it work with modern gasoline, so it doesn't get attacked. The ethanol additive in the gasoline is hugely corrosive and destroys the rubber and destroys the seals. I know we put on a fuel filter, which was not standard, but it's hidden underneath the car to keep junk from going into the engine. French cars, in general, tend to have softer suspensions than German cars. What a surprise. And they're designed for fairly, especially in the 30s, they were designed for fairly rough roads, erratic conditions that you might come into. They have enough ground clearance. The suspension is fairly soft. They made a stiffer dampener on the car. The shock absorber was a stiffer shock with softer springs. The Peugeot Dalma had a fairly nice ride. It was a good car. We've got pictures of it rallying in a lot of different conditions. Dorothy Patton was a rally driver before she was a full circuit course race driver. Most of the races they competed on were not at race courses, but were rallies from one city to another, and sometimes over multiple days in any kind of weather, in mountain passes. So these cars had to be capable of doing that sort of thing. She liked to drive with an open car. She did not like to have a roof over her head, so we only have one picture of the car where the convertible top was closed. As we're talking about a 1938 race car, the electricals are quite simple. And the electrical system has a series of switches. It has the ignition system, it has charging system, it has headlights. But a modern car would have electronic controls, and the electronic controls are much more sophisticated versions of ways to control the electrical switches. This is all mechanical, simple, basic stuff, which is why it is what it is in 1938. However, it all has to work. The first thing we discovered when we got this car was that the distributor, we have pictures of what the distributor was supposed to be, and it's an SEV distributor. It's made by a company in France that made electrical stuff. But the problem was it was the wrong distributor. What a distributor does is a distributor is the device that determines which of the spark plugs gets the spark at which time. And it's a rotary device that spins with the engine, usually controlled by the engine. And it goes in, and as the device, this rotor, goes around, it opens and closes a little switch called the points. And whenever those switches are activated, they send a spark from the ignition coil, which is like a giant storage system, sending a hot spark all the way to the spark plug. Then we had to rewire the switch for the lights, the switch for the ignition, the gauges, the lights behind the dashboard, all this little stuff that I would have expected might have been done but wasn't. And we had to redo all of this stuff, make it all work. So I spent a few weeks underneath the dash on my back, working over my head, trying to get all this stuff connected and working, functional, and we did finally, and everything works just fine. The switch for the horn and the lights is fairly sophisticated, and I had to find actually an original brochure and manual for that switch to be able to get it to work properly. It was very complicated, but it was made by Jaeger Company as a special switch device that would sit at the end of the steering column. The steering column is hollow with wires that go up to the horn button and the light switch. And if you push the horn button, you get a function of the horn, and if you turn the horn button, you get different light functions. So you get a light turning on one light, the right light, or turning on the left light only, which you would use for parking, or it would turn on the lights used only for driving in the city, which is a very small bulb within the light circuit, or it would turn on the low beams or the high beams. So that same switch would do all those functions, and that's by turning the knob in the middle of the steering. The original knob in the middle of the steering wheel was made of Bakelite. It matched the steering wheel, but unfortunately it had cracked. It wasn't working anymore. And we thought maybe we could epoxy it back together, but I didn't trust the epoxy, so we decided to make a new one out of aluminum, just to look just like the Bakelite knob, but to be stronger and be reliable. And so we did that and painted it, and now you can't tell the difference. Finding original headlights was a challenge because the car had been fitted with the wrong headlights. I think it was fitted with Marshall headlights, and Peugeot and Darromont never used Marshall headlights. They always used either CBA or Dusselier, I gather, mostly CBA, but we thought that based on the pictures that these were Dusselier lights. So we matched the Dusselier lights, but finding a pre-war lens for the lights was very, very hard because we wanted to find glass that existed from before World War II, and that sort of stuff is very difficult to find. People raced in all conditions, at all hours. They needed the lights to work. They had to be driving on roads where they had a 2,000-foot precipice right next to them. They were driving over rock roads and gravel. They were skidding around corners. They sometimes had snow, all kinds of inclement weather, rain. So yes, they needed good lights. And these lights were good. They were considered state of the art at the time. Some cars had driving light additions, which was another beam aimed sort of longer down the road. Sometimes they had some cars had lights where they would aim at the side, show the edges of the road. This car didn't have that, but this was sort of typical of what was common. If you're talking about batteries, and you're talking about lead-acid batteries, like the typical battery you have in a car, they're almost the same technology, haven't changed for decades, maybe 100 years. I mean, they go back a long, long way. Today, though, there's all sorts of lithium batteries, there's other things, there's a new silica battery coming out. Those are very, very different technologies. The lithium batteries are much smaller and are pretty effective, but they have certain limitations. They get hot and blow up or cause fires. They can they don't work if the charge drops below a certain voltage. So, I mean, there's certain things that they do and certain things that they don't do. And I don't think any point to using any of that new technology on one of these old cars, because we're really talking about the car that was designed to use old technology and make it work well. The car had a 12-volt battery when it was in England. Initially, when they were first built in France, they had 12-volt system, but it was two 6-volt batteries next to each other. And during COVID, I couldn't get vintage-looking 6-volt batteries, so we ended up with the Lucas vintage 12-volt battery for this car. The wires are an interesting question. In those days, the wires were still copper. They were stranded copper, just like we use today, although some of the modern cars use some various types of wiring choices and all sorts of other stuff makes another question. But assuming you're talking about regular stranded copper wires, we use usually some sort of vinyl covering today. They didn't have that. What they used at the time was cotton that was covered with a lacquered paint. So it was lacquered cotton. The problem with lacquered cotton was very good for an insulator. It worked fine, except that the lacquer would get hard, dry out, crack, and then the wires would start to be exposed and they would not be as good as they were. And it got to be a dangerous possibility if they could short against the side of the car and you have a hot wire grounding against the car or against another component. So for safety reasons, my feeling is that I don't mind using a wiring harness that looks right on the outside but uses modern wire on the inside, because it's a safety item. This is like changing the rubber on your tires. You know, the wiring has to be good, it has to be reliable, we have to know it's going to work, but I want the fittings on the wires and I want the appearance of the wire to be exactly as it was. Yeah, when we took the engine out and rebuilt the engine, we also rebuilt the clutch. We resurfaced the flywheel, we put in a new clutch pressure plate, new bushings, rebuilt the clutch disc, put in a new clutch disc, rebuilt surfaces on that, so the clutch would work properly. And it works great. We only use it in first and reverse, but nonetheless it needs to work. And truthfully said, you can use it in any gear, but you don't need to. That's the thing with the Kotal. So once you get used to it, you don't use it except in those gears. But we did the clutch, and then we also redid the brakes. The brakes had been not functional. They're cable brakes, so when you press the pedal, you're pulling a cable on each brake. They're adjusted to be pulled equally so you don't get sort of skew the car to the right or the left while you're driving, or not have brakes in the front or the rear. And we redid the brakes completely, put in new shoes. These are drum brakes. Again, the shoes go out into a drum surface. We redid the shoe surface, the friction surface on the shoe, to something that's designed to work with cable brakes. So this is a different material. If we were working with hydraulics, which put a lot more pressure on the brakes, we could use a different material. But because these are cable brakes and don't put as much pressure on the shoes, you need a softer material, but you don't want something that would wear out immediately if you had hydraulics. So there are a lot of choices in the restoration process of things you have to know in order to do something that functions properly today. So that discussion was the electrical components we just talked about, and now we'd like to talk about the last things that we had to restore in this car to bring it back together to its current state.